Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to talk about the intersection of two topics. One topic is fairly simple. It's essentially what's the intention of the person who's making a purchase, okay? We have questions about intention all the time. Anytime you do a performance, anytime you do something, we ask about your intentions. So it could be when you're doing a mitzvah, what was your intention in doing this mitzvah? If you do an avera, what was your intention in doing this avera? In our case, in Bava Batra, when you buy something, what was your intention in buying something? What did you think you were going to use it for? What did you want it for? Right? So that's one topic, the intention of a consumer. The other topic, rove, majority. Now, I'm not talking about rove, majority, as like I find a piece of meat and there are 10 stores in front of me and 6 of them are kosher and 4 of them are not. Right? That's Rubba de Itakaman. That's a rove, a majority that's in front of us. I'm not talking about that kind of majority, or like the majority of judges say guilty and the minority say innocent, right? That's not, or I find something in a place where the majority of people there are not Jewish versus, and a minority of people are Jewish, right? Do I have a requirement of Hashavat Aveda? I'm not talking about that kind of majority. I'm talking about what we call Ruba de Letakaman, a rove that's not in front of me, meaning the word usually, right? What is usually the case, right? Instead of thinking majority, what is usually the case? So, for example, is it usually the case that people are fertile? That's usually, in the majority of cases, people are fertile, right? And that's why it hurts so much when someone's going through infertility, obviously, right? All around, there are other things happening. Usually, let's say, for some reason, I can only think of intimacy questions. So let's stick with usually. Usually, the majority of people are fertile, right? So the question here is, what's the usually in a case of a financial transaction? If I want to know what is the intention of the person buying, do I look at, well, what's usually done in these situations? What do people usually buy a shiur for, buy an ox for, right? So that's our case. Our case is somebody bought an ox. It turns out that the ox is actually unusable as a plowing ox because it's a gorer. So now they're going to have to use it for meat. Well, is that what they bought it for? If they didn't buy it for that, can't they ask for their money back? So Rav says, usually when shiur is bought, it's bought for plowing. And therefore, I'm assuming here that the consumer's intention when they bought it was they wanted it for plowing. And now they can't use it for plowing, so they should get their money back. And Shmuel says, we don't use usually in dinei mamon, right? Nope. Sorry. If you can't figure out what the intention of the actual buyer was, if it wasn't made explicit, then the seller can just say, okay, so use it for meat. Who said I sold it to you as a plowing animal? We never had that conversation, and we're not following usually. So I'm really curious, because the Gemara doesn't just leave it as we don't follow usually in cases of mamonot, makes a clear distinction. In cases of Isser v'heter, right? In cases where we're talking about identity status, where we're talking about if something is asur or mutar, we do use rove. We do use the usually principle, right? And we say, well, if it's usually X, right? But in cases of mamon, we don't use usually. Now you've got my attention because I'm curious, why not use it in cases of mamon? Is there something specific to cases of mamon that would make you not want to use the usually principle? Or is it not in general, we don't use usually in cases of mamon, but maybe there are specific kinds of usuallys that we don't apply? So I guess we're going to see. I want to look at 3 different approaches to this question. Why does Shmuel not think that we should assume the intentions of a buyer based on what usually is the intention of everybody else, or most people at most times, or most situations? So let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen. So the first thing I have for you, which we're not going to do here inside, as it were, is I just have a few mishnayot for you to recognize that obviously in Dinei Mamonot, we follow a majority that's talking about a concrete majority that's sitting in front of us, right? Ruba Te'ita, come on. Obviously, right? If you find something in a place where most people are Jewish, you have a requirement to try to return it, right? Obviously, the same way we follow it in Isser, in terms of I found a piece of meat, I don't know where it's from, six chanuyot are kosher, 4 are not, right? That okay, holchin achar harov, you follow the road. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a concrete majority that's in front of us, right? So 1 and 2 give you examples of concrete majorities where we follow the concrete majority when it comes to dinei mamonot. But I'm more interested in ruba deleta kaman, right? Presumptions about how the world works, what usually happens. Does that help us determine what should happen here? And so I promised you 3 approaches. The truth is really 2 approaches. The first approach, and I'll explain why the 2 are really 3, right? Just to keep it confusing. The first approach is there's something specifically about dinei mamonot that makes us not want to use rov as a principle. Let's take a look. This is the Piskei Harid, Rav Yeshaya Ditrani, Italian. I'm always, for some reason, very excited when I can quote Italian commentaries. I don't know. I have like some dream that Italy was like this fascinating place for Jews, which it was. But that's also because I only know the pieces that I know. So Piskei Harid. Heicha Amar Shmuel delo Azlinan b'mamona bataruba. Where is it that Shmuel says that we shouldn't follow what usually happens to determine what should happen in this case, or what was the intention in this case? Hani mile, this applies heicha denitba muchzak b'mamon. It applies where the defendant is already in possession of the money. V'tovea ba'elafu mine. And the plaintiff is trying to get the money from the defendant. And the plaintiff has nothing to go on other than saying, well, in most cases, people intended for this, so I intended it for this, and therefore. There, Hatam Amar Shmuel de'in holchen b'mamon achar rov. There, Shmuel says, I'm not following the rov for this. I'm not following the usually for this. Why? Because there's another principle that's more important in dinei mamonot. Deruba v'chazaka de mamona, because when it's rov, the usually principle, presumptions, against actual possession of money, chazaka adifa, the possession of money wins. V'hamed mamon al chezkato, you leave the money where it is. V'hamotzi mechaveru alav haraya. And it's the one who's trying to get the money from the defendant's hands that has to bring real evidence, right? Just saying rov, it's not good enough. So the reason why we're not following usually is because generally speaking, in mamon, we have a principle that if you want to take money out of somebody else's pocket, you must provide evidence. Evidence is what's needed. Hard, ironclad evidence, not rove assumptions. Why? Because possession is 9/10 of the law when it comes to mamon, right? So there's nothing magical about the fact that we would follow rove in cases of isser, but not in cases of mamon. In cases of isser, I get it. In cases of mamon, there's an overriding principle. We don't take money out of somebody else's pocket unless we have an ironclad evidence. And that means, aval hecha de tovea itle ala nitba, but if there was a case where the plaintiff did have a legitimate, did have a legitimate claim, dematzi lemiskeba, that would be a good enough claim to get that money, ella deika plugta bene dayane, but there's an argument among the dayanim, ihav yatanya ma'alia, taina ma'alia ilo, whether it's a good claim or not a good claim. Shmuel would definitely say we follow the concrete rove of judges right there, right? Because we have a phrase that we use to understand that you incline after the majority. Meaning what the Piskei Rit just threw in is Shmuel only says no to Ruba Deleta, come on, and only when it goes against a Cheskat Mamon, someone being actually in possession, right? But if the rove is a Ruba Deita, come on, rove judges say something, we follow them, right? Meaning his point was it's just a rove is not enough to beat a Cheskat Mamon. That's what it is. You can't just take money out of somebody's hands. And by the way, smart policy. Like it's really smart policy. Like status quo, where it is, it is. Okay. So that's one type of answer for this, which is there's something specific to Dine Mamonot that is interested in keeping the money where it is. And the burden of proof is higher. Rove doesn't cut it. Okay. There's a different type of answer, which is not necessarily about whether Dine Mamonot as a category is different, but is actually about what kind of rove is Shmuel unwilling to use as definitive in no case. Not necessarily all rove shouldn't count, but what kind of rove doesn't count? So here, this approach of what kind of rove doesn't count actually divides into two because the Rishonim talk about it. And so I want to see each one because each one is kind of interesting in and of itself. So first of all, it's Tosfot in Sanhedrin who suggests that there might be this kind of rove. Usually a person, or usually the meat is bought, or a shiur is bought, I should say. I shouldn't say the meat. That's not, let's try that again. The rove that's mentioned in our Gemara in Bava Batra, that Ruba Laradya Zvine, most buy their shiur for the purpose of plowing, it's not as strong as other kinds of rove or other kinds of presumptions. And I want to know why. Again, it's not because Hamotzi Mechavero is so strong as a principle. It's because the rove here is not strong enough. So let's try to figure out why. So Tosfot mentioned it, number 6, but doesn't say why. So I'm going to offer us 2 different approaches as to why. And one is from the Bayit Chadash, Rav Yoel Circus, on the Choshen Mishpat, on Choshen Mishpat in the Torah, excuse me. And he says, and he's, by the way, not talking about the shiur case, he's talking about the case in the Mishnah. Somebody bought flax seeds, and it turns out that the flax seeds aren't growing, okay? It says, Vitama de Milta, it says, let me explain, Ta'afagav de Rov Zarapishtan Sheba Olam Nizra, even though it's possible that most flax seeds that are sold in the world are sown, are planted. There are a lot of people who still buy those things, those flax seeds, for other purposes. L'ma'achal, because they want to eat them. L'irfuah, because they want to use them for medicinal purposes. U'keneged adam echad shekoneh yud sa'in lizriya. And at the same time as you might have one person buying 10 sa'ah, a lot, that is, of flax seeds for the purpose of planting them, yesh mea b'nei adam shekonin mihat sa'ah achat l'machal u'l'refuah. Maybe there are 100 people who are each buying one sa'ah for the purpose of eating the flax seeds or for medicinal purposes. In other words, what the Beit Chadash says, what the Bach says, is the reason why there are certain roves, certain usualities that aren't so clear, that don't work, is because you could still have a difference between what happens to most seeds and what do most people do, right? Kind of depends on how many seeds people buy, right? If the people who are buying for Zriya buy a lot of seeds, you could say most seeds are sold for Zriya. But at the same time, maybe you have a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people, buying seeds to chew on them, to eat them for medicinal purposes, but they buy very few seeds at a time. So tell me, what exactly is the rove? So here the suggestion is the reason why certain roves, certain usualies are not going to work in momono cases is because it's not always clear cut what the what the object is of the rove that you're talking about. Is it about the seeds? Is it about the people? Not always so clear, right? And I like that because it sort of tells us, well, maybe we would want to use rove in Dina Memon, maybe sometimes we can if it's super clear cut. But there are times when not clear when we talk about the market. Are we talking about some presumption that inheres in the object itself? This object is usually bought for X. Or are we talking about a presumption that is supposed to inhere in people? And those may be two different assumptions, right? Now, to my mind, I sort of think I'd rather be thinking about most people. To me, that makes more sense to think about most people rather than inhering in the object itself. But I can see the logic in both directions. But either way, that's a second approach to why doesn't Shmuel want to use rove in Dine Mamonot? Maybe it's this kind of rove, a rove where you can't tell if it's about the product or if it's about the person. Now, is it possible that we can come up with other kinds of rove, even in financial matters? It's a fair question. But now I want to go back in time and I want to look at the Ritva's answer. The Ritva actually is talking about different types of rove in Isura, even in Isura Heter. He's not just talking about rove in Mamonot. And what he's trying to understand is, are there different kinds of rove? And here's what he suggests, okay? He suggests that you have something that is called aruba de bechiyuv v'teva. You can have a usually that is kind of by necessity. It's not, it's naturally a certain way, meaning she'eno talui biratzon. It's not based on someone's will. Kigon, for example, hahi de katanu ktana shechotzin umiyabmin. The idea that we would allow a minor to do chalitza or yibum. Very strange. V'lo chayshinan l'saris v'ailonit. It's strange because the whole purpose of yibum is to be able to carry on the name, of the deceased. We don't know if these people are going to be fertile or not. So we assume that they're not, meaning we assume that they'll be fertile. We assume that there won't be a problem. Why? Because to have a miyuta, because finding out that, he can't that they're infertile, either one of them, in either case, a girl or a boy doing this, that's the miyut of case, right? Says that's a kind of rove and miyut, right? Most cases people are fertile. That's a rove that doesn't have to do with someone making a choice. Okay. It has to do with what's naturally true, right? Or, for example, ukiaki amrinan, or like the following rove, the rove nashim ubarot yoldot. Most women who are pregnant end up giving birth. Umiyut mapilot, and sadly, the minority of cases, there could be a miscarriage. Okay. It's not something people are choosing. That's something that is anecdotally or anecdotally, or maybe even statistically, actually, let's be a little bit more serious about it. Statistically speaking, that's the rove of the cases. But there's a different kind of rove that we're talking about in our mamon case. Aval berov hatalui b'minhag. But if you're talking about a rove that is based on customary behavior, she'eno chiyuv, it's not required that someone behaves that way. V'kol adam sherotzen, anyone who wants, yachol linhog kiminhag hamiyut. They can do like the minority. Vadai choshishin lemiyut. In those cases, of course, we are concerned, especially when it comes to trying to be more machmir and more careful. We're concerned with the minority possibility as well. Meaning, when it's a situation where, when I say usually X is the case, that's not about people choosing for X to be the case. It's that it naturally is. When I say rove wins, but when we're talking about usually something is the case because usually that's the choice that people make. So what if usually that's the choice that people make? In this particular instance, they may choose to make a different choice. And so the Ritva is actually talking about cases of Isser v'Heter, but we're going to apply it to cases of Mamnut. Maybe it actually doesn't make a lot of sense to say that we're going to follow the rove when we're talking about most people buy for plowing. Okay, but nobody's forcing you to buy for plowing. You could buy if you want for meat. Maybe it just doesn't make sense to follow a volitional road, even if it's what most people do. And I find this really interesting because it's kind of pushing us to ask, oh, how formal or how formalized or how standardized do people's choices become in transactional halakha? Can we say that because most people choose X, we assume that you choose X also? Shmuel seems to be saying, no, there's an element of subjectivity when it comes to mamonot, that you can't just follow the wave. You have to actually try to be able to know what this person thinks. And if you can't, there's no reason to assume that they would follow everybody else. So those are our three positions on why Shmuel doesn't want rove used in mamonot as being definitive. Either because hamotzi mechaver alav haraya is stronger, meaning if a person is in possession of money, you can't take it out of their hands by arguing, well, usually something is the case. You need something more ironclad than that. Or there are certain kinds of robes, certain kinds of usuallys that don't really work. And according to the Bach, one kind of rove that shouldn't work is a rove where, yeah, it could be rove of the shores are bought for this purpose, but maybe rove people buy for a different purpose. And there might be a discrepancy between the way you look at the market based on the product and how much of it is bought, and the way you look at the market based on the people and how many people buy, even if they buy less product in total. And the Ritva offers there might be some kinds of rove that don't really make it as definitive, by the way, whether in Mamon or in Isser, because they're based on people's subjective choices. And so what if most people do X? How does that determine what I will do? Especially if we're going in Chumrah, especially if we're being strict and we're being careful, you might say, actually, we should be choshesh in the myriad of cases. And it could be that certainly in a case where I bought something from you and I gave you money and I now can't use it for what most people would buy it for, but I want to take money out of your hands with that argument. You could certainly say to me, who's to say that you did what most people do? Maybe your subjectivity, you were happy if you would just get to eat it as meat. And you can't come taking my money on the basis of that. So, subjectivity, markets, and possession as 9/10 of the law. You could sort of say that these are really cornerstones of many of our questions about transactions. Subjectivity, markets, and possession as 9/10 of the law. Thanks, everybody. Wishing you, I don't know when you're listening to this, but I'll wish you next week. Let's have an extra. We need it. Be well. Speak to you soon.